Yeah, so my name is Aya, and this book kind of started as a project my senior year when I was a student. It wasn't intentional that, like, I didn't intentionally make an effort to become an author. I majored in illustration at the Rhode Island School of Design, and I was taking a lot of literature classes at the time. So I ended up minoring in literary arts and studies, and I found that over time, a lot of my work just ended up combining like words and pictures in the illustration department. So I was making a lot of comics, zines, things like that. And my senior year, I took a class called Picture and Word with, it was like a joint class with the literature department and the illustration department, where we did like children's book, like writing and illustration. So it was like a 9-hour class once a week. So we had like a 3-hour segment to work on writing and then like a 6-hour segment to do like the illustration work. And most of our classes are like 6 hours, like in the illustration department. So it was just like an extended like class with more credits. And they were all like mini like weekly projects, but our final for that class was like a month-long process to work on a book dummy of like what would be like a finished picture book. So we actually wrote and illustrated like an entire dummy, but it was all like sketches with like 1 or 2 pages of final art. And I remember I posted that to my Instagram at the time, and it was noticed by like some people in the publishing industry. A RISD alum from like my department actually reached out, who works at Macmillan now, and she asked if I was considering pitching it to publishers. And I didn't know anything about that at the time, so I was like, oh, I don't know how that works, but that would be really great. So it just kind of went around to some people until my editor, Maggie Rosenthal at Viking, ultimately like picked it up. And I like immediately started talking to agents. So it all kind of happened really fast. It was just a project for my class. And it wasn't that I never thought of taking that seriously. I just didn't really realize that there would be an interest in a book like this, because I know that in the like publishing world, there's not a lot on Palestine. There's not a lot of Palestinian children's books that exist. So the fact that there was like an interest is a huge sign of the way that we like talk about this has like shifted in the last 5-6 years. So it's just really great that we like that I had the opportunity to like be a part of this and actually put this book out in the mainstream.
Well, we're so glad that you did, and we're going to get more into the actual what the story is about. But I want to take a few steps back first, because I think your story of how this became a published book is so amazing. The name of the book is These Olive Trees.
Yeah.
Someone was asking, and so I'm curious, because I love it when I talk to people who are illustrators and writers, as far as how the story comes to them, whether they write the text first and then the illustrations, or whether but it sounds like in yours, it sounds like it started more with the images and then the story came afterwards. Or what was that process like?
I think it was definitely like writing first, since it was like kind of started in a class. I had this like idea in my head. Like I knew that I wanted to tell like my grandmother's story. It was like the most natural story for me to tell, because it has shaped my entire life and it's the most common of the like Palestinian experience. So I wrote a draft like script, and the way that I usually work is that I would write like a line, and then I would like put a little note of like how I visualize that page to be. It's tricky with picture books because a lot of the like writing or like the words are just told through like a picture, obviously. Since it's a children's book, you don't want to put a lot of words on a page. So I would just like write a little bit and then put like an art note of like what I envisioned that look to look like, and just keep going. So technically I wrote it first, but I wrote it with like art notes in mind.
Right.
And then just did all the pictures. Yeah.
Yeah, and I should say, I was just rereading the book this morning, and the images, I mean, the story itself is really compelling, but the images are so powerful. There's one in particular, we could talk about this, at least for me, the one that was most powerful was when you were talking about, because it's a story about your grandmother in the refugee camp and how the war comes to the camp, and you have these like ghostly hands reaching into the camp from, I mean, it's kind of chilling picture to look at. So anybody who hasn't seen the book yet, I really encourage you to go look at it. But since this is such a personal story, like you said, I mean, in some ways it was really natural for you to tell your grandmother's story, but did that make it harder to work on because it was kind of like an emotional story for you, or did it make it seem like it flowed more easily?
I think definitely harder. Like a lot of my life has been shaped by the experiences of my grandmother and just the elders in our community. I was born and raised in Jordan, and Jordan has a very, very large Palestinian population. I believe, I don't remember exactly, but I think 80% of the Jordanian population today is of Palestinian descent because of the exile that happened in 1948 and what followed. So I think it was definitely harder to write because it's an experience that I didn't experience myself, but it is one that like our elders did and we experienced in memory. And I think a lot of us carry like a generational trauma, and because it's like a really common story, like it feels like we live it in memory, if that makes sense. And since the exile continues today, like it is an ongoing thing for Palestinians. Like Palestinian youth are still experiencing what their parents did and what their grandparents did. You see Palestinians getting displaced in Jerusalem, the West Bank settlements are expanding. So I think I was having a really hard time like trying to make sure that I not only like accurately like depicted the essence of my grandmother's story, but also like was like true to that. Like I care most about her opinion and the opinions of my family in the West Bank, particularly her siblings who are also around that age who also experience the same thing. So as long as they're happy, like I think it's good.
So
And although like I
how,
live in exile today, like you know I did not like live in the West Bank, and I think for a lot of Palestinian youth, like again, we experience what happened to them in our consciousness, and that's what this book is visually to me.
so how did they react to the book?
I don't know if they've read the whole thing yet, because like they're at home and I'm just here, and I've just been sending like little things. I also don't think a lot of them fully get what I'm doing, which is also funny. I'm just like, yeah, this book will exist, and they're just like, oh, like in a bookstore, like is it real? Like they don't really understand like how it's like actually going to be like published and sold and all of that.
Right.
But my grandmother's like really happy with like the visuals and all of that. There's also a language barrier, so I don't think they fully can understand it the way it is now. I really hope it gets translated into Arabic at some point. Like that would be great. But the like translation process with publishing is like another publisher in a foreign country like picks it up and does it like themselves. I'm sure like someone will at some point, but that would be like the best case scenario, and it would also reach like the children that it is about. There's still a lot of Palestinian children who live in refugee camps till this day. They're like third generation refugees, and if it could reach them, that would be like perfect.
That would be amazing. Well, we'll keep our eye, and then definitely if you have news to share about that, we'll make sure to share it on our channel, because that would be amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so I'm curious. Okay, so this is such a big story in a lot of ways. And did you have trouble figuring out how to tell it in a way that, like, what was your way into it to imagine this as a children's story? Was that kind of hard to think about how to put it in a picture book?
A little bit, yes, because for a book like this, I couldn't use words like occupation or settler colonialism. And it's not because they aren't like accurate to the Palestinian struggle and what happened to us, but because they would be very difficult to make sense of in a story for this age group. And language is so important when we talk about the Palestinian struggle because it's often talked about so poorly, particularly in North America. I think it's commonly framed as a conflict or as a war, which implies that there's two equal sides that are fighting it out over land, and that's not at all like what it is. So I think for me, it was really important to make sure that the author's note was a space to speak more casually and freely, because that's a section that I think is meant more for the parent or the adult that's reading the book with a child. Like you pick up a book and you read it with a child, and then you get to the author's note that allows you to have like context, like a historical context, to be able to have a conversation about it after. And I think that's what's super important for me. Like I want to make sure that the framing is correct there so that the adult explaining afterwards is able to have that language and speak properly.
Yeah, and I want to say how much I appreciated that as a reader, and also you are so generous. Though people may not know that we actually had a whole conversation before this IG Live, because it is like how you say, how it's framed in the media and how it's portrayed is it's really, as you say, it's not really portrayed correctly, and so having that author's context was really, really helpful. But talking about as far as the actual the text for the children itself, I love how you picked the olive and the olive tree as kind of the central metaphor. And one thing I noticed when I was rereading it is also because you talk about like bitterness and finding joy in bitterness and happiness and sorrow. But can you talk about why is the olive tree such a symbol of Palestinian culture and of and the culture, but also the refugee experience? Why did you choose that as like the central metaphor?
So it's definitely not something that I like came up with. The olive tree has long since been a symbol of Palestinian resistance because historically olives and olive oil have been fundamental to Palestinian history, culture, economy. Like a lot of people were like in the olive oil business making soap. My grandmother's family historically was in that business. It's also like drawn in the book a little bit. Um, and I think over time and following the colonization of Palestine, the olive tree became a symbol of steadfastness for its ability to thrive and send down deep roots in land where water is hard to come by. And also because they live so long, like a lot of the trees in Palestine are like 5,000 years old. And it's just become like a symbol of longevity. So that's why I gravitated towards it. I also noted this in the author's note, but the settler colony has historically like also done a lot of harm to the land. Since 1948, there have been hundreds of thousands of olive trees and olive groves that have been burnt down or cut down. And settlers, even to this day, will personally set fire to Palestinian olive trees or farmlands as an act of settler violence. So that makes it for me like a symbol that is even more relevant and personal. And I think a lot of Palestinians, like the Palestinian identity is an ethno-national identity, and it's heavily tied to land. Because if you do any research on like Palestinian society before the occupation and even before the British occupied Palestine, when it was part of the Ottoman Empire, it like a lot of the identity came from land because the population was mostly peasantry. So their like roots have been put down in a particular area and have been there for centuries or like 1,000 years. So I think that's why it like is something that people hold on to very dearly.
Right, and I just wanted to mention the comment we're getting about in Palestine, olive oil is called green gold, and that's why it's being uprooted by settlers. And I think your book is such a great illustration of why we need representation, and especially own voices stories, because like we had talked about, you know, who is telling these stories is so important, and there are big consequences for people not knowing these stories. Like for most of us and who don't know about these stories and don't really understand the situation, what's happening, then that has real world consequences for how we act on that. Let's see, and the olive trees had deep roots in land, just like Palestinians are rooted in their land, Palestine. So I'm trying to see the comments, because I know I don't want you to have to worry about reading while you're talking, but
yeah, I'm like reading upside down.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, that's very true.
But thank you everybody for your comments. We do appreciate that. And I'll make sure it said the right to narrate, Edward Said. Yes, it is so important in talking about representation. And one of the quotes from you that I love is, children need to see themselves represented and liberation needs imagination. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think, well, there's no debate over why picture books are important for children. And I think that when we see work towards publishing more diverse books, it goes beyond just letting kids see themselves represented on paper. And it's also more than just about pushing back against bias and prejudice. I think picture books fundamentally build empathy and allow you to put yourself in another child's shoes that may or may not have experienced what you're reading about. And also opens doors to conversations with adult figures around you, which is why I talked about the author's note and why it's so important. And a lot of people don't see the topics that this book explores particularly as like age appropriate, I think. That was like one of the things that was brought up when I was a student, like by my teachers. They were like, how do you like write something like this and make it age appropriate? But the reality is that millions of children are refugees, and this book is about a refugee child. So I think that it is age appropriate. Like millions of children do go through things that are considered adult experiences. And ending a story like this on a note of hopefulness and resilience, I think tells the child that their existence and their identity is radical. And that is so important in the way that they grow to build community and seek allyship for the rest of their lives. And for children who don't directly identify with the story, I think that they can identify with themes and certain characters. And I firmly believe that liberation across all identities, sects, etc., are bound together. So that's what I'm hoping that this book will like instill in children, like that idea, that seed.
Yeah, that seed that sometimes takes a long time to take root and to bear fruit, just like the olive trees. Yes. I think it is for everybody. If you, like I said before, if you haven't read it, it's such an important story, and I think it does. I mean, I was impressed at how you took something that adults have a hard time talking about and made it in a way that was really relatable to children. And like I said before, the images are also really powerful if you read it. So are you planning, now that you've had this one, I know just came out like just a few days ago, but are you thinking
it's not out yet, actually. It comes out on Tuesday.
On
Yeah.
Tuesdays. Sorry, I got dates mixed
Yes.
up because I was able to see
You're
every
good.
copy. So, but are you thinking about your next project? Do you think you'll do more children's books?
I definitely want to do more children's books. I don't know what I would write necessarily. I have been illustrating another children's book that I did not write, and that
Mm-hmm.
one comes out, I believe, February 6th. It's called Dear Muslim Child.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I've been working on, like while These Olive Trees was in print, basically, or like being printed. And this picture book is a lyrical, like picture book about just Muslim children. It's like a love letter to them that celebrates Islam and celebrates our identity. For the future, I would like to write more, definitely about Palestine, but also just about like maybe being an immigrant, being Muslim, any of these things that I think are lacking in the publishing world. And I also would like to write a graphic novel one day. I started working on one that was a comic when I was a student, and I would love to actually expand it into a graphic novel at some point. I don't know if that'll ever happen because it's really long, but eventually I think we'll get there.
That would be exciting. What was the topic, or are you still kind of working on it?
It's a memoir, the graphic novel. It's about my family across like generations and about my cousin, and like what happened to them.
Oh, that sounds really amazing. We'll keep an eye out for that, and for any other news. Like I said, we love to share stories like this, and so we will continue to do that. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with
Yeah,
us
of
today.
course.